What's up YouTube, Cody Bidlow with SprintingWorkouts.com. To make your training program most effective, it helps to know what aspect of performance you are developing with the exercises you select. In today's video, we'll be discussing how you can use ground contact times in certain exercises to decide which ones to use for developing specific parts of the sprint. First, we'll cover ground contact times in sprinting, then we'll discuss how tempo endurance training, resisted sprinting, and jump training are relevant to sprinting within the lens of ground contact times. We'll finish by talking about some progressions and ideas that may be helpful for you in planning your own training program. In deciding how relatable an exercise is to sprinting, we can look at things like ground contact times, ranges of motion, body positioning, force vectors, and probably a lot of other qualities. Ground contact times are easy to quantify, so for the sake of this video, we'll be using that. But understand there are many other factors that you can and should consider when planning your training. When deciding where a certain sled load, jump exercise, depth jump height might fit into your program, ground contact times can help us get some idea as to what part of the sprint a given exercise might be most relevant to. It's worth noting that ground contact times may vary quite a bit depending on fatigue levels and whether minor injuries are present, but we can still use ground contact times as one representation of how specific or relatable an exercise is to sprinting. So first, let's consider what the ground contact times are in sprinting. When we take a look at my own sprints, we can see ground contact times that are approximately as follows. For step 0, which is block clearance or getting out of the blocks, I'm looking at about a 0.35 to 0.40 time from when I can see myself initiating the push till when I actually leave the blocks. Then for step 1, around 0.20, step 2 around 0.13, and then step 3 and 4 are somewhere between 0.11 and 0.12. As I approach maximal velocity, it drops down to 0.08 or 0.09, and then it kind of stays that way until I start to decelerate. Based on these numbers, we can start to parse out what ground contact time durations on different exercises might be relevant to early acceleration, mid-acceleration, late acceleration, and maximal velocity sprinting. Exercises with ground contact times that range from 0.3 to 0.4 seconds might be more relevant to block clearance or step 0, whereas something like a 0.2 or 0.3 ground contact time might be more relevant to the first 10 meters of the sprint. Once we get below 0.2 seconds, that's where it's going to start to be more relevant for later acceleration and possibly even maximal velocity sprinting. Now let's take a second to talk about tempo endurance. So when looking at my own extensive tempo running, such as a workout like 6x150 meters at around 60 to 70% effort, I found that my ground contact times range from around 0.11 to 0.13 on most of the steps of the run. And this is essentially the same times that we see in early to mid acceleration during a maximal effort sprint. Given that the posture of tempo running is similar to maximal velocity and the ground contact times are only a few milliseconds longer, it would be reasonable to assume that tempo endurance running might have the potential to play a beneficial role in improving maximal effort sprinting. While the intensity of extensive tempo is far different from that of maximal effort sprinting, some of the component parts of tempo running, such as ground contact times, posture, and leg recovery, are quite similar to what we see in faster sprinting. Because of the higher running volumes and longer distances used in extensive tempo, this lower intensity variation of sprinting gives the athlete many opportunities to perfect their ground contact mechanics, to manage their posture, and to properly recover the leg through the air. Also, since the overall intensities are lower than maximal effort sprinting, the injury risk of extensive tempo is lower than maximal effort sprinting as long as the volumes are, kept within a reasonable range and the athlete makes sure to really emphasize good quality ground contacts, bringing that foot down and back to the ground, not lazily crashing forward into the ground every step. Considering these points, it makes sense that many of the most successful sprint programs in the world use a fair amount of extensive tempo and tempo endurance training. And it is worth considering how you might benefit from using tempo in your own sprint training program. Now let's take a look at resisted sprinting, and then we'll talk about some jumping exercises after that. Resisted sprinting is a great training tool which allows us to overload the force demands early in the sprint, to practice getting into aggressive acceleration positions and postures, and to play around with how much emphasis we place on force production versus stride frequency. The load that you use will dictate the effects of the work, with heavier loads likely being more useful for early acceleration compared to lighter loads. Obviously, there's a point at which increasing the load will begin to make the exercise less relevant to sprinting, but in general, I think we get more out of resisted sprinting with increased loads so long as we can still sprint with it or at least march with the load. Research from J.B. Morin, Petrakos, Jimenez-Reyes, Brown, Samazino, and Cross suggests that 80% body mass sled loads were more effective at improving 10 and 20 meter acceleration times in soccer players as compared to unresisted sprinting. And research from Kawamori, Newton, Hori, and Nosaka shows that sled loads which caused a 30% increase in sprint times were more effective at improving 5 meter and 10 meter acceleration times, whereas loads which caused only a 10% increase in sprint times led to a smaller improvement at 10 meters and no improvement at 5 meters. These studies help support the concept that heavier loads on the sled may lead to greater improvements in short sprints compared to lighter loads. Whether the lighter load helped longer sprint distances compared to heavy loads is uncertain at this time, albeit something that would be logical to assume. Ultimately, we need more research done in this area to see if those lighter sled loads would help the longer sprints compared to the heavier loads, helping those shorter distances. In my own training, 100-pound sled pulls on turf show similar times as a 200-pound sled pull for step 0, but I see significant differences in the later steps of the resisted sprint. For example, 200-pound sled pulls did not go below 0.22 seconds of ground contact by step 5, whereas a 100-pound sled pull showed a ground contact time of 0.15 by step 5. So these are pretty significant differences in my mind as far as if we're choosing between the two different loads and what we're trying to accomplish by using the resisted sprinting. These differences in ground contact times might help us decide whether the 100-pound versus the 200-pound sled is going to be more useful to us. With these numbers in mind, it seems to my pea-sized brain that the 200-pound sled pull on turf would be more relevant to the first couple steps of the sprint, whereas the 100-pound sled pull on turf might be more relatable to mid-acceleration, such as from 5 to 15 meters. For example, if we see that an athlete struggles with the earlier steps of the sprint, they might benefit more from relatively heavier loads, such as the 200-pound sled, seeing as the majority of the steps exhibit ground contact times that are similar to step 1 in unresisted sprinting, and the body position is more forward-oriented than lighter sled loads. This body positioning allows the athlete to work on stabbing back at the ground without opening up the knee, which is technique we tend to see in the first couple steps of the sprint. So here we have a combination of ground contact times, positioning, and technique that show us that this load on the sled might be more relevant to those earlier steps of the sprint compared to the lighter load sled. Another athlete might clear the blocks well, but struggle between 5 and 10 or 5 and 20 meters. These athletes might be better off working with a lighter load, such as the 100-pound sled, as the ground contact times and body positioning would be more similar to what is seen in mid-acceleration during unloaded sprinting. Now we're going to move on and talk about some jumping exercises. Jump training and plyometrics are useful tools in your sprint training and speed development toolbox. Being that jump training is a very broad category encompassing everything from simple in-place hops to very intense depth jumps and bounding activities, it would help to have some buckets in which to place jump exercises as far as their relevance to the different parts of the sprint. Let's take a look at ground contact times I've seen in various jumps and see if we can take away anything as far as how this relates to exercise selection based on ground contact times. So from my own training data, the following jumps can be roughly categorized as follows. For very early acceleration, I'm looking at ground contact times between 0.3 and 0.4 or 0.31 and 0.4. This includes a 36-inch squat jump, so that's starting in a squatted position and just doing a concentric jump onto a 36-inch box. A walking counter movement jump with a straight leg landing onto a 42-inch box. That was around 0.40 as well. Same as the squat jump. Then we got a 42-inch reverse depth jump, so this is stepping backwards off of a box, doing a depth jump, and then landing back up on the box. This was 0.35. A 48-inch walking counter movement jump and a 36-inch walking counter movement jump both showed pretty similar times of 0.35 and 0.33. Now for early and mid acceleration, we're looking at trying to target ground contact times of 0.20 to 0.30. And these are the exercises that, or at least some of the exercises that I've found to fit into this bucket. So first we got the 6-inch single leg horizontal depth jump. So this is dropping off of a 6-inch box onto one leg and then jumping for distance from that, ground contact. And that was around 0.30 seconds. A 24-inch depth jump to a 36-inch box. I got 0.28 seconds on average. Then we got a 12-inch single leg depth jump to a 30-inch box is around 0.26. A couple other depth jumps, 18 and 12-inch, both going to 36-inch boxes, were around the same time of 0.24 to 0.25. We got single leg cycle bound, so basically a cycling your leg, single leg bound type of thing, as well as a 6-inch single leg depth jump to a 30-inch box. Those were both 0.22 seconds for ground contact times. And then to finish this category off, we got a 24-inch depth jump to a 42-inch box and a 36-inch reverse depth jump, which were 0.21 and 0.20 seconds respectively. So these times are more relevant to, kind of early and mid acceleration, maybe not the first step of the sprint, but probably, or rather, maybe not block clearance, but they'd be more relevant to step 1, step 2, and maybe step 3 of the sprint. Then if we want to look at a, mid acceleration to maximal velocity type of category, we're looking at least in the times that I've registered, from 0.13 to 0.17 seconds. And this includes doing a 12-inch depth jump to a 12-inch box. So that's dropping off a 12-inch box, hitting the ground, and jumping back up to a 12-inch box. In this, I've been able to get 0.13 to 0.15 seconds. So that's getting pretty close to what we'll see in maximal velocity sprinting. Pretty similar to tempo endurance running as well. And then we got pogo hops moving forward. Same 0.13 to 0.15 seconds. And then in-place pogo hops, which were 0.13 to 0.17 seconds. Now, in all of these exercises, deeper knee bend typically equates to longer ground contact times, and this combination of knee bend and ground contact time helps shed some light on where in the sprint the exercises might be most relevant. Early in the sprint, we contact the ground with a deeper knee bend, we spend more time on the ground, and all that. As we accelerate, we rise to taller postures, ground contact times reduce, and the leg becomes more straight during ground contact. Just like we talked about with the sleds, we can look to the area of the sprint in which you need to improve and target those abilities with exercises that are closer on the spectrum of relatability by looking at ground contact times. So for example, if an athlete who struggles over the first couple steps of the sprint, they might be well suited to use just squat jumps, progressing toward a squat jump that is immediately followed by a reverse depth jump. The squat jump itself has some relevance to block clearance or step 0 because of the purely concentric nature of the jump, while adding the reverse depth jump after that squat jump adds relatability to step 1, as the athlete has to do that concentric movement to clear the blocks, and then they have to reverse their limbs, hit the ground again for step 1. Well, when you do the squat jump and then the reverse depth jump, you're sort of mimicking that same type of pattern of movement. So this is, something that someone could use if they struggle in those first couple steps of the sprint. This exercise could be further progressed by adding more reverse depth jumps or by modifying the box height. So maybe you go from a 30-inch box to a 36-inch box to a 40-inch box over time. Or you could go from, say, a squat jump to a squat jump that's followed by the reverse depth jump. And then you could go from squat jump to doing 2 reverse depth jumps so that you have 3 jumps total in that set. In contrast, the athlete who struggles at top speed or fails to maintain high velocities after acceleration would likely benefit more from exercises like in-place pogo hops, pogo jumps moving forward, and low depth jumps onto a low box, where you're really emphasizing that very brief ground contact time. Athletes who struggle with getting off the ground quickly during sprinting can progress from moderate jump heights and medium duration ground contact times to lower jumps with shorter ground contact times, as this will challenge their coordination and their ability to stay stiff and get off the ground quickly. Now, as far as progressions go, in the past, I would often think about progression simply as either, lifting more weight, jumping higher, using a higher depth jump drop height, and just overall kind of a more load type of mindset. But nowadays I look at things slightly differently. For example, it's arguably easier to try to jump higher in a pogo hop at the expense of greater knee bend and longer ground contact times, compared to minimizing ground contact times, which is harder. But how would it be helpful in improving maximal velocity sprinting when we don't have a lot of time available and we only need a small amount of vertical lift to get into the next stride? This starts to put into question just the jump higher type of mentality. Recently, some research was put out by Jad Adrian Washif and Jean-Lee Koch, I don't know how to say it, but anyways. And this showed that jump height, flight time, which is a result of jump height, and reactive strength index of 35 centimeter or 13.7 inch depth jumps had significant correlations with faster sprint times, but they did not see these same correlations with a 50 centimeter or 19.68 inch depth jump. So this is showing that, there might be some credence to using lower drop heights, since what is most relevant to sprinting? getting off the ground quickly, not necessarily jumping as high as possible or, enduring the really high forces of a higher depth jump. This might lend some credence to the idea that getting off the ground quickly is more relevant to fast sprinting than jumps that might be more forceful but take more time to get off the ground due to greater amortization, joint yielding, knee bending, and all that stuff. Now, this is not to say that higher depth jump heights are not useful for any sprinter out there, but considering the potential injury risk that comes with using high depth jump heights, it makes sense to me that we can use low depth jumps with fast ground contact times in a wider number of athletes, in more athletes, than we could the higher depth jumps. Now, considering that lower depth jumps were more correlated with fast sprinting, which they deemed as around 10.5 seconds versus the slow group was 11 seconds, this combination of stronger correlations and lower injury risk seems to me like a good combination and a good reason to use these low depth jump heights to really work on getting off the ground quickly and being stiff for very brief moments in time. Once an athlete feels that a certain low depth jump height is no longer having an effect, they could progress the drop heights by small amounts while aiming to maintain similar ground contact times, RSI or reactive strength index, and jump heights as they progress. But you would want to make these adjustments in small increments. So maybe you go from a 12-inch box to a 14 to 16-inch box, then 16 to 18-inch box, and you're trying to maintain those very brief ground contacts, those very stiff positions while on the ground, getting off the ground quickly, and having that be the focus more so than dropping, loading up, and launching. Now, if you struggle with early acceleration, maybe you need to do more of those, deeper knee bend, more forceful types of depth jumps. But I would say for the average athlete, because of the risks involved and because of the correlations we see in this study, it's really worth considering whether or not you actually need to go to that higher jump height, or if you could accomplish the needs that you're trying to target with those more intense depth jumps, if that could be worked on elsewhere, and then we just stick with these lower depth jumps as a way to work on getting off the ground quickly and being stiff like we want to see in maximal velocity sprinting. Now, to wrap things up, when you're putting together a training program and you're trying to decide what exercises to include, some of your program can be built to target your weaker areas of the sprint. If you find that you're struggling more with very early acceleration, consider incorporating exercises which mimic the ground contact times and positions of that part of the race, such as by using heavier sled loads and jumps that have higher ground contact times or longer ground contact times and higher force output demands. If instead you accelerate well early in the sprint, but you struggle with continuing to accelerate deeper into the sprint, you might be better off emphasizing shorter ground contact time duration exercises, such as using lighter load sleds, lower depth jump heights, or using exercises like pogo hops in place or moving forward over the ground. Remember that this approach is not going to solve all your exercise selection issues or cover every aspect of your training, but this approach can help guide you towards certain exercises and give you better probability of seeing the adaptation that you feel you need to get. This is not something that you have to, get totally neurotic over and just, abandon everything and only think about ground contact times. But I think, if we're looking at 5 different exercises and we only have space for one in our program, that's where this can start to come into to be useful. If okay, I really struggle between 10 and 20 meters. All right, find the positions that you're in it between 10 and 20 meters. Look at the ground contact times that you're, seeing when you're sprinting, and then look at the different jump exercises that you're comfortable with. Find the one that fits most, both from a body positioning and a ground contact time perspective, and see if that helps. If it doesn't, you can find another exercise and try again. But instead of just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, we can narrow down our selection of exercises by looking at ground contact times, body positioning, and things like that to help us make decisions on whether we should use this exercise or that exercise in our training program. At the end of the day, we can get away with not being perfect with our exercise selection. So the goal of this is just to give you one way of trying to, parse out what might be better for you depending on what your needs are as a sprinter. We all have individual needs. We all have different things we need to work on. And so if we can target with our training program the weaknesses that we're trying to develop, and especially work on these things in the off season, we'll have a better chance of performing well when the season comes around and it's time to compete. So Thank you guys for watching this video. I really appreciate your time. I know your time's valuable, so don't want to keep you waiting any longer than you need to. But if you like the video, please hit a thumbs up. Consider subscribing in case you haven't. Hit that membership join button if you want to get a membership and get some minor perks and help support the channel. But other than that, I will catch you guys next time. This is Cody Bidlow with SprintingWorkouts.com, signing off.